Hello everyone, welcome to our second webcast on being an exceptional executive. I'm Jim Lewis, and I appreciate you joining me today during your lunch hour. And I want to just say a couple things about this series. I went into organizational psychology because I felt that if I could make a difference in an organization, it would have a widespread effect on a lot of people, and I still believe that to be true. And I particularly believe that it's important that we have more people like you who are here because you'd like to be better at what you do. And I learned when I worked at ITT in Raleigh, North Carolina, we had about 1,100 employees, and we had about 9 general managers up till the point when the current one came on board. And he was there for, I think, about 10 years. I left during the time he was there and went into business for myself. But I learned that the organization culture takes on the personality of the person at the very top. And I have found that to be true in 35 years of consulting to companies around the world, some 30 different countries, and about 60,000 people have gone through programs I've taught. And so it's really important that we begin helping executives perform at the best they're capable of doing. And so that's what this program's all about. We've just started an executive certificate program at NC State, and a couple of mini certificates, one of them on executive leadership. So I'll just go ahead and say now that this course is not your typical leadership training program. It's not about learning leadership skills, although I would highly recommend that if you haven't had any training in leadership, you definitely can benefit from that, because none of us are born being experts at it. I will say, however, that it helps if the person teaching the leadership training has been in the trenches. One of the things that I realized years ago when I was like a mid-level manager was that you can't really appreciate the job executives have or managers have until you've had to struggle with having to terminate someone who doesn't perform for whatever reason. It can be lack of capability, or it can also be bad attitude or bad work habits and whatnot. And the landscape is changing because we now have the millennials in the workplace, and we have Generation Y and Generation X, and the old timers who are the baby boomers who are reaching retirement. Many of them already have retired. And it's very difficult to get a good soup out of a pot that is blended with all kinds of ingredients like that. And so leadership skills are absolutely essential. However, as you see on the notes in this slide, if you have your notes page handy, effective leadership is not just about the behavior of leaders. It's also about the nature of followers and the situation and the environment in which interactions occur. James McGregor Burns wrote a book back in the 70s on leadership, in which he said, we've studied an awful lot of stuff on the nature of leaders, but we have not really talked much about the nature of followers. And as the old saying goes, you may lead a horse to water, but you may not be able to get him to drink. And so leadership is just part of the equation. The nature of followers in the situation is also important. So having said that, I want to just quickly define what leadership is according to Vance Packard, who I think his definition is one of the best. He said, leadership is the art of getting other people to do something that you feel needs to be done. And I left the word out. Leadership is the art of getting others to want to do something that you feel should be done. So in other words, it also has to do with motivation. And the easiest way to understand it is following should be a voluntary thing. People should be eager to follow you because they want to go where you're going. And so that's an important component. And Lao Tzu, the Chinese sage, wrote many years ago that when a job is done and the people say we did it ourselves, that's the mark of a good leader. And so, as Peter Drucker used to say, much of what we call leadership is manipulation. It's trying to get people to do things that they really don't want to do. And then having people come to you and say, how do I get these people to do these things? Well, find people that like to do those things is the best thing. But of course, all of us have to do things we don't want to do occasionally. And so we will have to do some coaxing, persuading, and so on. One of the things that I learned very early in my career is that if you don't have credibility with people, you just might as well forget about all the leadership practices and all the ploys and things that you do, being nice and all that kind of thing. You have to have credibility. And an example of that was a class I attended years ago on project management. And the instructor had a problem-solving exercise that he had us do. And I was working on a master's in psych at the time. I was about 35 years old, been working for 8 or 9 years in the workplace. And he asked me to observe the interaction in the group, and I did. And the first thing that happened was a small group of about 6 people, and one fellow in the group said, "Oh, I've seen this before." And so immediately the rest of the group started listening to him to see if he could solve the problem, and it didn't take him very long to realize that he may have seen the problem, but he'd forgotten how to solve it. And so as soon as that happened, they dropped him like a hot potato and turned to someone else to help them solve the problem. So I learned an important lesson just in that few minutes of interaction in that team, that people who are going to follow you will do so because they think you can get them to the destination. That is, you can help them solve the problem or whatnot. And if you can't do that, you lose credibility. Now, there are 3 factors that determine whether followers will be willing and able to respond to a leader as you would desire, and those are shown in the figure on the slide. I worked this out a long time ago to show how you achieve high-performance project management, and I realized a while back that it really is a universal model for getting performance from people. And it consists of the 3 components: people, tools, and systems. And we'll talk a little more about these specifically in a moment. But we are taught that if we improve the accounting department in an organization, it's going to improve the whole company, and that's not necessarily the case. So a lot of what happens, and especially, and I mean no offense when I say this, but executives will send all their people off to be trained thinking that if they get the people trained, it'll fix all their problems. Well, it will fix a major part of the problem. But if you don't address the tools and systems, you'll find that people come back to the job and they can't really perform what they've learned. And after a while, the training that they were given has been totally ineffective, and you're inclined to think, well, must not have been a very good training program. Well, that might be the case on occasion, but it's not usually the main thing. The environment, especially the systems that they go back to and the tools that they have to use, will be a major component. And I want to address the whole thing about optimizing systems. Dr. Edwards Deming, the quality guru who came back from Japan and helped us improve quality in the 80s, liked to say that improving the accounting department and letting the rest of the organization stand still is suboptimization, and it won't necessarily make the organization better. And this is simply illustrated by the little diagram here. If you have a process that has 3 steps in it, and you're making some kind of widgets or units or something, and step 1 has a capacity of producing 100 units per hour. Step 2 is improved to the point where it can handle 200 units per hour, but step 3 still can only do 100 units per hour. You haven't improved anything. Step 2 will be limited by both the preceding and the succeeding steps in the process. So we have to jointly optimize things. Another way to say this is that if you went out and found the world's best automobile engine, and you took that and you put that in the world's best automobile body, and tied it to the world's best transmission, you may not have a really very good car because they have been optimized independently of each other and not jointly optimized. So we have to keep that in mind. Certainly you need to do training, and I'm going to say a little more about that now that we're going to get to the 3 components. First of all, one of the people that you need to train the most are your frontline supervisors. The typical progression in most organizations for engineers and supervisors and programmers, and even for some of you who are executives, is because you were good at the job you did, you got promoted, and you kept getting promoted from a technical job to a managerial job to an executive job without being given any training. It's like people think that it's a genetic thing. You're born with it, and unfortunately that just isn't the case. And we know from all the research that's been done that one of the biggest problems organizations have is with relationships between direct frontline employees and their supervisors. And it's not the fault of supervisors necessarily or the employees. It's the fact that we have assumed that if they were good technical people, they'll be good managers, and that's not the case. In fact, there's an almost inverse correlation between a really superstar engineer, programmer, operator, and being a good supervisor, because a lot of times what they lack is people skills. And I talked about this in the last webcast about the fact that we don't know how to get performance from people, and one of the best models for getting good performance from people is the sports model, if you look at what coaches do. So you can't get people skills from a cereal box, and I'm going to be candid, you can't get them from a Dale Carnegie course if you don't internalize them. I know someone who told me about a person who went through a Dale Carnegie program. This person had terrible people skills, and he was just enamored of Dale Carnegie. He thought he had the key to Pandora's box, and I think that might be what he did have, because he faked all that stuff. He faked caring about people, and he tried to slap them on the back and rah-rah and all that good stuff, and none of that worked. And so people want to know that you're genuine, that you care about them, that you're sincere, and you just can't fake that. If you don't care about people, best not to try to fake it. I did tell you about the engineering manager who practiced management by walking around, and he would go around and chat with people for just a couple of minutes every morning. How you doing? What kind of work you doing? What kind of issues you got? And it made a huge difference in the climate of the organization. So that's the first step for you. Now, as far as the people that work for you are concerned, they need training in things like teamwork, conflict management, creativity and innovation, how to communicate effectively, full spectrum thinking, how to get the most out of the brain power that they have. And you know, it's a shame that we have to teach people how to be team players, but our school system actually puts down team practice in some ways, because you know, kids are more encouraged to work individually, and especially in engineering and science. And so they come into the workplace kind of thinking that there's something wrong with that. And Gerald Harvey, who wrote the Abilene Paradox story, said that he defines cheating in class as not helping anybody that asks for it. So we need to encourage that back at the grade school level. And this is one of the things that sports coaches have to work on, is teaching people to be team players. So it's a shame we have to do it with adults, but we do. And we also need to learn how to deal with conflict. Conflict, a lot of people think we don't want conflict. That's absolutely wrong. We want conflict over ideas, and we don't want conflict at the interpersonal level. And one of the ways that arises is if you critique somebody else's idea in the wrong way, you're going to generate conflict. So for example, if you're in a brainstorming session and somebody says, how about we do this? And someone else says, oh, I think that's a stupid idea. You just put the person down. What you want to do is you want to say, well, I have some concerns about that particular suggestion for these reasons, and keep it as logical as possible. And even then, sometimes people get a little bit rattled and angry because you're critiquing their idea. But certainly it's better than equating them with being stupid. So teaching group leaders to facilitate discussion so that you can create new ideas without people getting upset about them is one of the ways that you need to work. Also, at the executive level, you need to make sure that you have a synergistic team, a complementary team, one that balances you in some way. And I'm telling you that a lot of us find ourselves hiring people like ourselves because it's easy to communicate with them and you feel understood by them and so on. So a lot of times we clone ourselves at whatever level we're at. If you're a CEO, you'll have a bunch of C-level executives who all are cut from the same cloth, and that makes communication very nice, but it doesn't necessarily mean that you got a good balance. And you really need people that'll disagree with you and do it in the right way so that you have the benefit of differing opinions about things. Otherwise, if they're going to agree with everything I say, what do I need them for? So the people part is probably the most important component of the mix, but again, you don't want to just focus on it to the exclusion of the others. So if we look at tools, you might think of tools as things like software, but it also includes, to use David Keirsey's meaning of the word tool, anything that you use to get the job done. And that includes the working environment and so on. Those of you who are strong extroverts probably have read a lot these days about working with introverts, and it turns out that most extroverts don't understand introverts very well because they do tend to prefer working by themselves. And one of the things that really differentiates them from an extrovert is that they are easily distracted by noise around them. So extroverts like an open work environment, and introverts tend to hate that because the noise keeps them from doing what they're usually paid to do, which is to think. And so I've often said, I used to visit a machine shop in Moxville, North Carolina that was run by Ingersoll Rand, and they make these big reverse thread screw compressor air compressors, and the tolerances on those things are so tight that they have to be made in matched pairs. They can't make them individually, or at least they couldn't years ago. They may be able to now. And all the equipment that they had in that place, and it was multi-million-dollar machines, had to be air conditioned because they wouldn't function if they weren't in the right environment. And I went to an automotive manufacturing company out in Iowa one time to teach, and it was unair conditioned, and it was 105 or so outside and just miserable inside. And I'm thinking, those people treat equipment better than they do their human beings, and it's true. So consider the environment. Is it conducive to getting work done? There are times when you want teams to collaborate and interact a lot, and other times when people need quiet time to think and work alone. And so I don't think one size fits all by any means. Sometimes you need the open environment, and sometimes it needs to be, you need privacy. And certainly you need the right equipment. One of the things that we had at a small company I worked at was a lack of tools and equipment to do the work sometimes. And so two people are trying to get access to a piece of test equipment at the same time. That's the nature of small companies, and it has its advantages, but those can be major disadvantages. So be sure people have all the tools they need, including the facilities and so on, to do the work. And next is systems. And systems are really interesting because what most people don't understand is that systems are a large component of the cause of behavior. And let me just give you a couple of examples of what we mean by systems. First of all, everybody knows we have management information systems out there. Those are supposed to provide managers with the information that they need in order to be able to make good decisions. So They tell you about your profitability. They tell you about your cost structure. They tell you about the status of inventory, orders, and how many things various customers buy from you. And of course, if you know the 80-20 rule, one of the things we find is that 80% of our work, our profits come from 20% of our customers, and the other 80% consume a lot of effort just to service them. And sometimes it's best to get rid of some of those 80% customers who don't really buy from you but give you a lot of grief. Reward systems. Dr. Deming used to say two things: what is measured gets done, and what's rewarded gets done. And if you reward the wrong thing, you'll get the wrong behavior. So we have to be careful about that. Performance tracking systems, and I'm going to talk about those in a moment. And then communication systems. Now, I said to you that systems are a large determinant of how people behave. And at first glance, that sounds a little surprising and maybe even incorrect. But Peter Senge, who wrote the book, The Fifth Discipline, proved this a long time ago with a game called the beer game. And the beer game goes like this. There's a beer called Love Beer that 7-Eleven type stores sell, maybe 4 cases a month, case a week. And that's not a very big seller. And one day people start coming in and buying Love Beer like it's going out of style. And the 7-Eleven stores don't know why at first, but they soon learn that there's a song, a popular song that's come out that mentions Love Beer by name, and people are coming in trying it just to see what it's like. Well, of course, they run out of inventory fairly quickly, so they have to call the distributor and say, send me some more beer. People are buying it like crazy. And this is going on throughout the whole region, so the distributor has to call the small brewery and say, hey, send me some more beer. Well, they can't produce that much beer, and so they have to start working a second shift to meet the demand. But even a second shift is problematic because you can't make beer out of nothing, so they have to start ordering more raw materials. And so all this stuff is backed up in the pipeline. Well, this goes on for maybe a couple of months, and then all of a sudden the novelty wears off, the beer's not all that wonderful, and sales go back to zip, 4 cases a month. Problem is, all those orders are still in the pipeline for the more beer and more raw materials, and they even had started hiring some additional people, and they haven't even come on the job yet, and they have to tell them, I'm sorry, you don't have a job. Senge talks about this as a boom-bust cycle, and he said Nolan Bushnell fell into this trap twice back in the 80s when personal computers were coming on board. And he says it's caused by a delay in the feedback system. And here's what's significant. Senge says we have run this simulation. They actually run this as a simulation. He said we've run the simulation with all kinds of people. MBA students, engineers, programmers, people from all different nationalities, people from different genders, different age groups, and so on. And he said the result is always the same, which says the system generates the behavior. Well, Dr. Deming knew this as well before Senge ever came up with the research that proved it. And Dr. Deming used to say, it's management's responsibility to make sure the systems in place support the behavior that they want. And so if you have a reward system or a measurement system that actually inhibits the kind of behavior you want, you're not going to get what you need. And he demonstrated that in a couple of different ways, which I won't go into, but he showed that you could admonish workers to do it right the first time, and unless you fix the system so it was possible for them to do it right the first time, it was impossible for them to perform at the level you expected. And that leads me to my next slide. I'm going to be totally blunt and candid when I say this. One of the worst done things in organizations is performance appraisals. And the worst one to me is the exceeds or meets or falls below expectations. And I found this slide and used it to illustrate my point. The guy on the left, for whom this redheaded lady has worked, says, "You far exceeded my expectations, Jan. Great work." Lady in the middle saying, "She sure didn't exceed my expectations." And the other fellow's thinking, "This is incredible. Same person working for two different people, and she exceeded the expectations of one person and didn't meet the expectations of another." And that's the problem with measuring people based on expectations. If they work for several different people, you may find that they get glowing reviews from one person, not from someone else. So the preferred approach is to use what are called behaviorally anchored rating scales. And just to illustrate that, we have an old joke about this person is like Superman or Superwoman, leaps tall buildings in a single bound, and that's a 10 on a 10-point scale. And down around a 5, the person may use a helicopter to get over a building, and down at a 1, not only can he not get over the building, he runs into them. And so a behavioral anchored rating scale would describe at each point along the scale what performance the person exhibits that can be observed and measured to get the evaluation that you give them. So that's a better way. The problem you got is you have to be able to really observe someone working in order to be able to evaluate them correctly. And perceptions are biased, and most of us don't have the opportunity to observe people all the time, and so it's really difficult. Now, I'm not saying that performance shouldn't be evaluated. I'm saying it's badly done. And so let's take another look at one more aspect of it. There are people out there who can run the mile in less than 4 minutes. I'm not one of them. So if you were hiring someone to run the 4-minute mile, you don't want me in the job. And if you hire me and set that as my goal, it's absolutely useless because it's outside my capability. So Dr. Deming admonished very strongly about setting goals that are outside the capability of the person, because they can only stay within their own standard deviation, their own little normal distribution curve. And so not only can I not perform, but the fact that I am admonished to do better than I'm capable of doing simply serves to demotivate me over time, because I realize I'll never be able to achieve the intended result. And although there are exceptions to what I'm going to say, I think that most people in the workplace want to perform at the expected level of their boss, make them happy, make them proud, and so on. And so setting goals for people that they can't achieve just tends to demotivate instead of serving the other way. Now, that's one of the steps that I wanted to mention. Now, here's the next thing. We bastardize statistics by forcing managers to fit their people into a normal distribution curve that goes from 1 to 10. Now, if you do your job correctly as a manager, you don't have any ones for very long, because you should get rid of them, okay? And if you look at a normal distribution for the population of people who come in and apply for jobs, what you may be doing, if you look at the little red oval over there, is selecting just the cream of the crop. Now, I know nobody has the luxury to do this all the time, but there are a few companies like Hewlett-Packard who used to do a very good job at selecting the cream of the crop. I had an engineer working for me at one time who said to me privately that he really would love to work for them because they were considered to be one of the best companies for an engineer to work at the time. And we were working on a project together. He was one of my engineers in my team. And I said, "Why don't you go interview him?" And he thought I was kind of crazy or something. You mean you're suggesting I go look for another job? I said, "You owe it to yourself. You know, I own your job, but you have to own your career. And you need to do what's best for you. So if you really want to work for Hewlett-Packard, go interview them. And if you leave, I'll hate to see you go, but it's in your best interest." So he did get an interview, flew out to Colorado, I believe was the group he was trying to get on with. And they gave him a really, really heavy-duty technical interview, which he failed. and he came back to work with his tail tucked between his legs and gave up on his aspiration to go work for Hewlett-Packard. The thing about it is, the longer he'd sat there harboring that desire, the less useful he'd become to me. And this way, he at least accepted the reality that he was sort of stuck at a place that wasn't quite up to the same standards HP was, perhaps. But the point is, HP had the luxury of selecting only the best from the engineering pool. And so they had a bunch of 8s, 9s, and 10s, okay? As a matter of fact, here's what your normal distribution curve looks like if you've selected that small group. On the lower end is an 8, and on the upper end is a 10, and 9 somewhere around the middle. And even that distribution is probably not correct, because it's probably more likely this kind of distribution, where you don't have anybody below 8, and you got a bunch of people spread out from 9 to 10, and so it's a skewed distribution. Skews upward and terminates on the lower end. So forcing managers to categorize people as 1 through 10 is just wrong. And the people that get the 1 could be 9s, and they feel cheated by having been rated that way. So don't do that. That's just not a good way to go about it. All right. Now, I know that all I'm saying sounds very negative, and this is going to make it even more so, but I have a reason for saying this. You can't be an effective executive or an effective leader if you're doing things that are turning people off, because they're not going to willingly follow your lead if they're turned off. And so here's the thing. There's a big difference between an unmotivated workforce and a demotivated workforce. Now, unmotivated people can probably be turned on. Demotivated people, on the other hand, probably can't until you quit demotivating them. And so Frederick Hertzberg years ago wrote an article about motivation and said, there are things that motivate people, and those include things like achievement, recognition, self-actualization, all those good things. And there are things in the workplace that turn people off, and these are, he called the demotivators. And those demotivators include things like rigid policies that prohibit people from doing things, bad relationships with first-line supervisors or whatever supervisor they're with, bad working conditions, and pay. And this is a big argument point for a lot of people. Pay actually serves as a demotivator when it's inadequate or unacceptable, and it doesn't do much to motivate people when it is acceptable. Yeah, there are some people that say, I'm motivated to make a lot more money. Yeah, you're motivated to make more money because of what you want to do with it. It's not the money itself that matters to you. It's what you want to do with it. And so one of the things that Hertzberg said was, you can't be turned on and turned off at the same time. And if you're doing things that are turning people off, you have to quit that before the motivators will work. And so if you have a bunch of factors in the workplace where people are being turned off, you got to work on those first and fix those, okay? Now, just to illustrate what true motivation really is, there may be some of you that have done this at one time or still do it. I've always marveled at the people that go out here and go up these sheer rock cliffs. Part of the reason I marvel at them is I have vertigo pretty badly, and so if I get very high off the ground, I'm dizzy. And so cliff climbing is not one of those things that I have any desire to do. But if you have someone that is motivated by cliff climbing, they really like that sort of thing. All you have to do is come by one day and say, hey, John, Jim, we're going over to such and such a location and scale that cliff this weekend. You want to go with us? And that person says, you bet. And off they go. See, that's the nature of leadership. Leadership is getting people to want to do something you think should be done. Well, you don't even have to work very hard to get somebody to do something that they already like to do. It's like eating ice cream. You don't have to beg a child to eat ice cream as a rule. I don't think I've ever known a child that didn't like ice cream, maybe certain flavors, but In general, they like it. So true motivation is always intrinsic. And one of the problems that we've had in the workplace is we try to use pay for performance and all that sort of thing. And Alfie Kahn wrote a book years ago called Punished by Rewards, in which he said that almost all the pay for performance systems blow up eventually because they are seen as unfair by someone, and pretty soon they have a negative effect instead of a positive effect. And I believe that's true. So again, our job as executives is to make sure that we have an environment that is intrinsically motivating to people, and that we're not using external rewards and measures and things to turn people on. People should come into the workplace happy and looking forward to doing what you have for them to do. Now you say, well, what about the young people that come in with an entitlement mentality? Some of them don't really want to work. They just want a paycheck, and they think they ought to get paid for just showing up. You know, I know there are some of those, but one of the things that I think it's safest to do is to assume that everybody who comes in would like to make a contribution. And I can remember years ago when I was a young engineer, wanting to do more than I was probably able to do at the time, and feeling like I wasn't appreciated and wasn't listened to. I think a lot of young people go through that. You probably did yourself, particularly if you're a high achiever. So we have to make sure that we don't turn people down in such a way that we turn them off. And if we can find ways to let them make contributions, then I think we get better results. So this session is going to be a little shorter than the others. The next slide is kind of a closing slide here. You can't be effective as a leader if these issues are causing performance deficits in your people. So to just recap, we need to mutually or jointly optimize tools, people, and systems in order to get good results. If any one of those things is out of whack in some way, then you're not going to have good results in terms of leadership. And you definitely can't have people turned on and turned off at the same time, and you must take care of the turned off part first, take care of the negative things first, and then you can practice all the positive components. If you personally need leadership training, you might want to check out the programs on this last slide. And incidentally, if you have not downloaded your notes, the link that you got today has the link to download the notes for this program. So this page will be in your notes themselves. And we do have the Executive Excellence Certificate program, and we have some mini certificates in the series on leadership and management and so on, and one on multicultural things and negotiation. So if you're interested, take a look. We also have a weekend workshop coming up called Winning Beats Losing. It's a weekend summit in May 14th and 15th, I believe it is. And there's a link on the slide to that. So thank you so much for being here. If you have questions, remember, drop me a note at lewisinstitute.com, and there is a contact me point on the website, so you can send me a question. I'll be glad to try to answer them. Or you can send me an email at drjimlewis@yahoo.com. So thanks very much. This is a short one. Take care. Have a good week.